the fractured memory of Christian history, one name emerges whenever fire threatens, illness spreads, or faith is mocked without mercy. Saint Catherine of Siena stands as a protector claimed by flames, the sick, nurses, nations, and the ridiculed, long before such titles were ever written down. These titles did not form in comfort or ceremony. They surfaced through fear, endurance, and proximity to danger. People turned toward Saint Catherine of Siena not because she promised safety, but because she remained present where safety had already collapsed and fear ruled without restraint. By the late 14th century, memories of her presence moved faster than official recognition. In hospitals, homes, and city streets, her name circulated alongside stories of survival, courage, and unexplained endurance. Patronage emerged first among witnesses, not institutions, shaped by lived experience rather than decree. Saint Catherine of Siena became associated with fire not through spectacle, but through calm defiance. Flames symbolized chaos, destruction, and loss of control. She entered spaces marked by danger without retreat, and that refusal to withdraw transformed fire from terror into a threshold others believed she could cross. Illness defined her world. Plague, infection, and decay were constants rather than exceptions. Saint Catherine of Siena did not heal from a distance. She touched bodies others avoided, remained among the sick when fear drove crowds away, and accepted physical risk as an unavoidable cost of witness. Those mocked for belief found unexpected refuge in her example. She faced ridicule without retaliation, public doubt without retreat. Over time, her endurance reframed mockery as a test rather than a defeat. This quiet resilience anchored her later recognition as a protector of scorned faith. Nurses and caregivers later claimed her as their own, recognizing patterns familiar to their work. Exhaustion, exposure, and unseen labor defined her service. Saint Catherine of Siena embodied care performed without applause, where persistence mattered more than recognition and presence outweighed visible success. By the time her name extended beyond Siena toward nations and distant communities, patronage had already taken shape through memory. These roles did not emerge from miracles alone, but from repeated encounters with danger, survived, fear endured, and lives altered by proximity to her unwavering presence. In 1347, as the Black Death tightened its grip on central Italy, Siena's streets filled with carts of bodies and unanswered prayers. It was in this atmosphere of decay and fear that Saint Catherine of Siena entered the world. Born not into safety, but into a city already collapsing under mortality. She was the 25th child of a family stretched thin by loss. Survival was never assumed. Half of her siblings would not reach adulthood, and from her first breath, life existed beside death as an ordinary companion, rather than an abstract threat within the household. Catherine did not arrive alone. She was born a twin, sharing the womb and the risk. Her sister did not survive infancy. This silent absence followed her life like an unspoken echo, a reminder that survival itself had already drawn an invisible line between endurance and disappearance. The city around her mirrored that fragile balance. Siena's narrow streets carried the sounds of bells, mourning, and quarantine. Infection erased boundaries between homes. For Saint Catherine of Siena, danger was not a future challenge, but a condition present before memory could form. Her parents were ordinary people facing extraordinary pressure. Her father worked as a dyer, staining cloth with permanent color, while death marked families just as indelibly. Her mother, already 40, managed grief with routine, raising children while uncertainty pressed in from every direction. No signs accompanied the birth. No witnesses claimed wonder. Yet survival itself became the first anomaly. St. Catherine of Siena lived where many did not, breathed where others failed, and remained present in a generation thinned by disease, scarcity, and constant proximity to sudden loss. Growing up, she absorbed instability as normal. Illness arrived without warning. Absence replaced familiarity. These early conditions shaped a tolerance for fragility that later defined her actions. Fear did not surprise her. It had been present since the beginning of her remembered world. This beginning raised an unresolved question that would follow her life. Was survival a matter of chance, or the first demand placed upon her? The city offered no answer. Siena only bore witness, as a child born amid plague quietly endured. As Catherine reached adolescence in Siena, family expectations hardened into pressure. Marriage was presented not as a choice, but as a correction. A widower was proposed. Stability was promised. St. Catherine of Siena did not answer with words, but with resistance shaped through withdrawal. Her refusal unsettled the household. She did not argue doctrine or destiny. Instead, she altered her body. Food became scarce. Silence expanded. She cut her hair short, dismantling the visible markers of desirability that defined her role within domestic and social expectations. What appeared as defiance carried physical cost. Hunger weakened her frame. Isolation narrowed her world. St. Catherine of Siena accepted this erosion deliberately, treating discomfort as evidence of resolve rather than failure, and transforming bodily resistance into a private battleground. Her parents reacted with confusion and force. Restrictions followed. Comfort was withdrawn. Yet pressure only sharpened her refusal. St. Catherine of Siena did not retreat into rebellion. She endured constraint, allowing discipline to replace argument and persistence to outlast confrontation. This was not a theatrical rejection of society. There were no public declarations. The conflict unfolded behind walls, through routine strain and daily endurance. Each meal refused, and each hour of silence reinforced a choice that demanded constant renewal rather than sudden escape. Observers later questioned her motives. Some saw immaturity, others obstinacy. Few recognized the pattern forming beneath the surface. St. Catherine of Siena was not escaping marriage alone. She was severing the authority of appetite over decision, redefining control through deprivation. Over time, the household adjusted. Resistance without collapse altered perception. Her parents softened, not through persuasion, but exhaustion. What could not be forced gradually became tolerated, allowing her an uneasy freedom shaped by endurance rather than agreement. This period closed without resolution. No triumph followed. Only a question lingered. Was this youthful extremity or preparation for something harsher ahead? The answer remained suspended, as St. Catherine of Siena carried this discipline forwards into a life that would demand, without walls or vows. St. Catherine of Siena transformed her family home in Siena into a private enclosure. Silence replaced ceremony. Routine replaced ritual. What appeared ordinary from the street concealed a disciplined interior life operating beyond supervision or public recognition. She withdrew deliberately, limiting speech and contact. Hours once shaped by household noise narrowed into patterned stillness. This was not escape, but containment. St. Catherine of Siena compressed her world to sharpen attention, reducing distraction until intention remained the dominant force. During this period, learning began. Dominican women introduced her to reading and sacred texts. Letters and words entered a life previously governed by sensation. Literacy expanded her reach, allowing thought to travel where the body remained confined, quietly increasing her authority. The discipline intensified rather than softened. Sleep shortened. Food remained minimal. Tasks were accepted without negotiation. St. Catherine of Siena treated repetition as training, forging consistency under conditions that offered neither praise nor immediate consequence. Service continued within confinement. She cleaned, cooked, and obeyed without recognition. Yet even these tasks carried intention. Every motion became measured. Every action reinforced a structure that replaced instinct with control and impulse with deliberate restraint. Observers saw withdrawal and assumed passivity. They misread stillness as absence. St. Catherine of Siena was accumulating endurance. This period did not diminish her presence. It concentrated it, preparing her to operate under pressure without collapse or hesitation. The absence of spectacle mattered. No visions were announced, no signs were claimed. Instead, discipline matured unseen. This concealed formation ensured that when movement resumed, it would be decisive, not experimental, anchored by habits already tested in isolation. By the end of this phase, the question sharpened. Why would such restraint be necessary? St. Catherine of Siena was not preparing to disappear. The silence suggested anticipation, as if this hidden structure awaited a command that had not yet arrived. At the age of 21, the silence surrounding St. Catherine of Siena fractured. In a moment she would later describe with restraint rather than spectacle, an encounter occurred that altered direction rather than emotion, signaling not escape from the world, but an irreversible re-entry under different authority. She spoke of a marriage not recognized by witnesses or ritual. No public vow followed. No celebratory sign appeared. Yet St. Catherine of Siena insisted the experience carried binding force, reshaping obligation, loyalty, and command beyond familial or civic expectation. At the center of the account stood a ring. Descriptions diverged immediately. Some later claimed it was gold and jeweled. Others recorded her insistence that it was formed from Christ's own flesh. St. Catherine of Siena maintained one detail consistently. The ring remained invisible to others. This invisibility complicated interpretation. No physical evidence emerged. No shared vision confirmed the moment. Skeptics remained unconvinced, yet the aftermath proved tangible. St. Catherine of Siena's patterns shifted abruptly, as withdrawal gave way to movement and private discipline prepared for public demand. Mystical theology would later frame the event as sponsal union, a symbolic binding of soul and divine will. The narrative itself avoided abstraction. St. Catherine of Siena focused not on sensation, but consequence, emphasizing obligation over ecstasy and direction over emotional intensity. The experience did not elevate her above others. It redirected her toward them. Shortly after, she reported receiving instruction to leave isolation and return to human suffering. The vision carried command, not comfort, transforming contemplation into responsibility rather than refuge. Those close to her observed immediate change. Stillness gave way to urgency. Silence yielded to speech when needed. St. Catherine of Siena appeared driven by a clarity that resisted delay, as if time itself had narrowed and demanded response rather than further preparation. Whether interpreted as vision, psychology, or devotion, the result remained uncontested. After this moment, retreat was no longer possible. St. Catherine of Siena moved forward bound by an unseen commitment, carrying a sign no one could verify, yet many would later feel. The command did not suggest retreat or contemplation. It demanded movement. St. Catherine of Siena left the controlled silence of her home and stepped back into Siena's streets, where illness lingered openly and suffering no longer remained an abstraction contained by distance or discipline. Hospitals became her immediate destination. These were not places of recovery, but of waiting. Infection saturated rooms. Odors of decay marked the air. St. Catherine of Siena entered without hesitation, crossing thresholds most avoided, accepting exposure as the cost of obedience rather than a heroic choice. She approached bodies others refused to touch. Wounds were washed, food was delivered, words were spoken without performance. St. Catherine of Siena did not frame this work as sacrifice. It appeared procedural, as if service had replaced solitude with an equally demanding form of restraint. Fear operated differently here. It was visible, immediate, and contagious. Many withdrew after brief contact. St. Catherine of Siena remained. Her presence altered rooms not through command, but through duration, staying longer than expected and returning after others had already retreated. Observers questioned her endurance. She was physically slight, marked by fasting and exhaustion. Yet movement replaced fragility. St. Catherine of Siena navigated spaces of contagion with steady repetition, allowing routine to neutralize fear and persistence to replace initial shock. This work quickly exceeded private charity. People noticed patterns. Where she appeared, disorder softened. Not every outcome could be explained. St. Catherine of Siena attracted attention not through claims, but through the consistency of presence where collapse was already assumed. Service expanded beyond hospitals into homes and alleys. The excluded became familiar. St. Catherine of Siena crossed social boundaries without announcement, treating proximity as obligation rather than risk, and redefining contact as an act of witness rather than defiance. The question sharpened with each return. How long could this continue? The work offered no protection, no retreat, and no applause. St. Catherine of Siena pressed forward regardless, as if endurance itself had become the measure by which the command would be tested. Plague redefined proximity. Infection clung to skin, fabric, and breath. Within hospital rooms, fear settled before symptoms appeared. St. Catherine of Siena entered these spaces without ceremony, accepting contamination as unavoidable and treating contact not as risk, but as necessary engagement. She washed wounds others refused to approach. Pus and blood marked her hands. Food was brought to mouths too weak to lift themselves. St. Catherine of Siena moved methodically, as if repetition could impose order where panic had already erased structure. Those confined watched closely. Some expected collapse. Others waited for retreat. Instead, she returned. Day after day, her presence became predictable. In an environment defined by sudden loss, consistency itself began to register as something unusual. Stories emerged quietly. A fever that broke unexpectedly. A wound that closed faster than anticipated. Breath that steadied after hours of decline. No proclamation followed. St. Catherine of Siena made no claim, yet observers began connecting recovery with her sustained presence. Not all outcomes aligned. Many still died. Suffering remained dominant. Yet contrast sharpened attention. Where improvement occurred, witnesses remembered sequence and proximity, noting timing rather than cause. St. Catherine of Siena became part of these remembered patterns, without explanation attached. Skepticism persisted alongside belief. Some attributed recovery to chance or misjudgment. Others spoke of intervention. The environment offered no clarity. St. Catherine of Siena neither confirmed nor denied interpretation, continuing her work without adjusting behavior or acknowledging speculation. Her endurance surprised observers more than recovery itself. Exposure weakened her body, yet movement continued. St. Catherine of Siena accepted physical cost without modification, as if limits were irrelevant to the task already underway. By the time word spread beyond the wards, a threshold had been crossed. Whether healing occurred or not, association had formed. St. Catherine of Siena was now linked with survival in spaces designed for death, and that connection would not dissolve easily. Accounts surrounding stigmata surfaced as her public presence expanded. Yet, no visible wounds were recorded by observers. St. Catherine of Siena acknowledged pain without display, describing an interior marking that resisted verification, leaving witnesses divided between belief, doubt, and unease as her strength steadily declined, physically evident. Unlike earlier healing stories, this claim offered no recovery, only cost. Her hands trembled, her body weakened, and exhaustion followed persistent fasting. St. Catherine of Siena accepted the suffering as restraint imposed inwardly, insisting the wounds remained unseen to prevent distraction from obligation and public spectacle formation. Reports intensified after 1375 as witnesses compared her physical decline with increasing activity. Walking became difficult. Pain interrupted speech. Yet St. Catherine of Siena continued traveling and serving, creating tension between visible deterioration and an authority that appeared to strengthen rather than recede under sustained pressure conditions. Skeptics questioned whether extreme fasting explained her condition, attributing weakness to self-inflicted harm rather than divine encounter. Others argued that discipline alone could not account for her endurance. St. Catherine of Siena offered no defense, allowing interpretation to fracture while her body absorbed consequence without verbal resistance. The absence of visible marks intensified uncertainty. No blood confirmed the claim, no wound demanded care. Instead, witnesses noted restraint, as if suffering had been deliberately hidden. St. Catherine of Siena framed this concealment as protection, preventing attention from drifting away from service toward her physical pain. Physically, her condition worsened. Weakness limited movement. Illness followed strain. Yet withdrawal never occurred. St. Catherine of Siena continued entering contested spaces, accepting damage without recalibration, as though bodily collapse itself had become an instrument shaping credibility through endurance under constant observation pressure and communal memory formation. For believers, the stigmata represented silent confirmation of intimacy with suffering Christ. For others, it marked psychological extremity. The record preserved both views. St. Catherine of Siena remained unchanged in practice, letting interpretation multiply while action continued uninterrupted across communities without official resolution or final judgment rendered. Whether miracle or consequence, this phase redefined her witness. Healing drew hope outward, suffering turned inward. St. Catherine of Siena advanced, carrying a body under strain, leaving observers with one unresolved tension. Was the wound a sign, or the price itself paid through continued obedient exposure alone? The cell was sealed hours before execution. Stone walls trapped breath and time together. Condemned for political violence, the prisoner awaited death without appeal. St. Catherine of Siena entered the confined space calmly, crossing a boundary few dared approach, where final moments carried irreversible weight. She did not debate innocence or law. Her focus narrowed to presence. Words were measured. Silence filled gaps where fear surfaced. St. Catherine of Siena remained beside the condemned man as execution approached, anchoring attention not on escape, but on the manner in which death would be faced. Witnesses later recalled a change. Panic softened. Resistance weakened. The condemned listened. St. Catherine of Siena spoke of mercy without promise, encouraging surrender rather than hope. What occurred in that interval left no record beyond memory, and the prisoner's altered composure before guards returned to escort him. At the moment of execution, she remained nearby. Accounts diverged sharply here. St. Catherine of Siena later claimed she saw the man's soul rise toward heaven, freed at the instant of death. No one else reported seeing anything beyond the fall of a body. Silence followed. No public declaration was made. Authorities recorded only procedure. Witnesses avoided comment. The claims circulated privately, carried by those inclined to believe and dismissed by others unwilling to accept unseen conclusions drawn from a single observer at an emotionally charged threshold. Skeptics questioned the account immediately. Stress, suggestion, and proximity to violence offered explanations. Supporters argued transformation mattered more than vision. St. Catherine of Siena neither defended nor elaborated the claim, allowing ambiguity to persist without reinforcement or withdrawal from subsequent public responsibility. What remained uncontested was the effect. The condemned man did not resist death. Witnesses noted composure unusual for such scenes. Whether attributed to counsel or conviction, St. Catherine of Siena's involvement became inseparable from the memory of a death marked by unexpected calm. This episode hardened divisions around her legacy. Some saw proof of intercessory power. Others saw projection under pressure. The record preserved both. St. Catherine of Siena continued forward unchanged, leaving behind a moment suspended between redemption and doubt, unresolved and permanently resistant to closure. In Avignon, far from Rome, papal authority drifted amid political fracture and fear. St. Catherine of Siena dictated letters without title or office, addressing the Pope directly, challenging delay, urging return, and inserting spiritual urgency into negotiations normally governed by power, caution, and diplomatic paralysis prevailing norms. Her intervention disrupted expectations. Advisors questioned legitimacy. Courtiers resisted tone. Yet St. Catherine of Siena persisted, framing obedience as responsibility rather than submission, and treating hesitation as moral risk, not strategy, within a church divided between locations, loyalties, and unresolved authority during a volatile ecclesiastical crisis unfolding. These letters carried neither threat nor flattery. They pressed conscience. St. Catherine of Siena invoked unity, repentance, and accountability, insisting that delay weakened faith publicly. Her words traveled faster than envoys, circulating among clerics, provoking debate, and forcing spiritual language into political calculation across contested European corridors. Resistance hardened as influence grew. Some dismissed her as presumptuous. Others listened closely. St. Catherine of Siena remained unmoved, dictating with urgency shaped by conviction, not ambition, positioning herself between sacred duty and institutional hesitation at a moment when neutrality itself carried consequences for divided Christendom's future. The stakes extended beyond geography. A papacy divided weakened credibility across kingdoms already strained by war. St. Catherine of Siena emphasized return to Rome as symbolic repair. restoring continuity through presence, not decree, and reasserting moral gravity over administrative convenience and prolonged uncertainty within medieval European consciousness. Eventually, movement followed pressure. The Pope returned to Rome, though conflict remained unresolved. St. Catherine of Siena did not claim victory. She shifted focus immediately, treating the return not as conclusion, but as one fragile step within a broader, unfinished struggle affecting church unity, authority, legitimacy, stability. Her involvement altered perception permanently. A laywoman's voice had penetrated papal decision-making. St. Catherine of Siena demonstrated that spiritual authority could exert pressure without office, revealing an unsettling dynamic between conviction and hierarchy during periods of institutional vulnerability across late medieval ecclesiastical power structures and contested legitimacy. This episode reframed her mission. Service expanded into intervention. St. Catherine of Siena now operated within historical consequence, where words redirected institutions. The question shifted again. Could a woman's dictated sentences withstand the pressures unleashed by reform, resistance, and inevitable backlash across fractured ecclesiastical landscapes, cities, loyalties? Italian city-states fractured under rebellion and reprisal. Alliances shifted rapidly. Streets absorbed blood faster than treaties formed. St. Catherine of Siena entered this volatility without mandate, stepping between factions where words often failed, and where neutrality itself was interpreted as complicity or weakness. She traveled amid tension, addressing leaders hardened by conflict. St. Catherine of Siena framed peace not as concession, but as responsibility, insisting continued violence corroded legitimacy. Her presence unsettled councils accustomed to force, introducing moral urgency into calculations shaped by survival, dominance, and public fear. Reactions divided sharply. Some dismissed her as idealistic, others listened cautiously. St. Catherine of Siena persisted regardless, pressing for reconciliation while acknowledging cost. She neither minimized grievances nor excused brutality, forcing adversaries to confront consequences extending beyond immediate victory or territorial control. Negotiations unfolded under pressure. Agreements collapsed quickly. Yet St. Catherine of Siena returned repeatedly, absorbing failure without retreat. Her persistence reframed peace as process rather than event, testing endurance not through triumph, but through willingness to re-engage after visible disappointment and renewed hostilities erupted. Violence did not pause for reflection. Executions continued. Cities burned. St. Catherine of Siena operated within this reality, refusing abstraction. She spoke directly of loss, responsibility, and moral erosion. Confronting leaders with outcomes their strategies normalized but rarely acknowledged publicly or personally. Skeptics questioned effectiveness. What could persuasion accomplish amid war? St. Catherine of Siena offered no guarantee. She treated intervention as obligation, not solution, insisting that failure to attempt reconciliations carried its own weight, equal to the violence it allowed to persist unchallenged. Her involvement altered expectations. Spiritual authority crossed into civic negotiation. St. Catherine of Siena blurred boundaries deliberately, asserting that conscience did not end at city walls. This intrusion provoked resistance, but also compelled dialogue previously suppressed by fear, pride, and political inertia. Peace remained fragile, incomplete, and contested. Yet her actions left residue. St. Catherine of Siena proved engagement possible without arms. Whether naive or necessary remained debated. But her refusal to withdraw established a model of witness operating within conflict, rather than above it. More than 400 letters flowed from dictated urgency, carried by scribes across Italy and beyond. Saint Catherine of Siena transformed speech into action, pressing conscience, correcting rulers, consoling the fractured, and inserting moral pressure where force had failed. Allowing words to travel faster than armies alone, these writings avoided ornament. Commands remained clear, direct, and urgent. Saint Catherine of Siena framed reform as responsibility, not ideology, insisting delay weakened faith publicly. Readers reported unease, recognition, and compulsion as sentences disrupted habits, demanded response, and exposed complacency within institutions accustomed to caution and inertia. Her major work, The Dialogue, organized experience into structured confrontation. Saint Catherine of Siena staged conversation between soul and divine will, forcing readers into participation. The text functioned less as instruction than provocation, pressing accountability, obedience, and interior change without permitting passive distance or safe detachment ever. Unlike physical miracles, these words accumulated gradually. Letters circulated, were reread, and remembered. Saint Catherine of Siena accepted no authorship display, dictating relentlessly while others wrote. Authority emerged from repetition as ideas returned unchanged until resistance softened and decisions shifted under sustained verbal pressure over time, repeatedly. Skeptics measured impact cautiously. Could language truly reform power? Yet correspondence altered behavior, summoned meetings, and reframed priorities. Saint Catherine of Siena's words disrupted routines, creating moral inconvenience that leaders could not easily ignore, even when rejecting conclusions, because attention itself had been forcibly redirected toward responsibility. The miracle here resisted measurement. No wounds closed, no bodies rose. Instead, resolve shifted. Saint Catherine of Siena leveraged speech to penetrate conscience, turning abstract belief into demand. Transformation occurred internally first, then publicly, as choices aligned slowly with convictions previously postponed despite risk, resistance, pressure, cost. Dictation accelerated as her health declined. Weakness did not reduce output. Saint Catherine of Siena pressed on, treating urgency as obligation. Words multiplied where strength failed, suggesting that authority no longer depended on endurance of body, but persistence of message under strain and widening reach beyond limits. By the end, language defined her legacy. Saint Catherine of Siena demonstrated that words could function as instruments of change, reshaping institutions without force. This miracle lacked spectacle, yet endured longest, continuing to influence conscience wherever her sentences were encountered and weighed across generations, cultures, borders, centuries. Years of fasting narrowed her strength to a fragile margin. Movement slowed, pain intensified. Saint Catherine of Siena's body no longer sustained the pace of her obligations, yet withdrawal never followed. Decline unfolded publicly, visible to witnesses who expected collapse but observed persistence instead. Illness advanced without drama, limbs weakened, speech faltered. Saint Catherine of Siena struggled to stand, then to walk, and finally to function without assistance. Yet presence remained. Authority no longer emerged from action, but from endurance under conditions where agency steadily dissolved. A stroke further limited her capacity. Sensation dulled, control diminished. Saint Catherine of Siena's body resisted command, forcing others to adjust around her. Despite this, attention gathered. Silence did not reduce influence. Absence of motion intensified focus. Compressing meaning into stillness, observers documented contradiction. Physical weakness deepened as moral pressure persisted. St. Catherine of Siena continued dictation when speech allowed. Relying on others to transmit intent, dependence increased, yet direction remained clear, suggesting authority had shifted from exertion to presence alone. Skeptics interpreted decline as consequence of extremity. Supporters framed it as offering. St. Catherine of Siena declined explanation. She neither justified fasting nor revised discipline. The body absorbed cost quietly, as if deterioration itself had become part of the witness being enacted. This phase unfolded slowly. No singular collapse marked transition. St. Catherine of Siena's deterioration stretched over time, forcing sustained observation. The absence of spectacle tested attention, requiring patience from those seeking signs, miracles, or resolution through sudden reversal. Despite impairment, requests continued. Leaders sought counsel, followers remained. St. Catherine of Siena responded when possible, refusing disengagement. Influence no longer depended on physical participation. Words, memory, and reputation carried momentum, independent of bodily capacity. The question sharpened as decline progressed. Was this a slow extinction or concentration of meaning? St. Catherine of Siena advanced toward an ending defined not by disappearance, but by a presence that persisted even as the body failed to sustain it fully. In 1380, Rome offered no ceremony, no crowds gathered. St. Catherine of Siena lay weakened by illness and paralysis, her body reduced to stillness. The city continued its routines as death approached quietly, without signs announcing that a life of consequence was ending. Her final days unfolded without spectacle. Speech failed, movement ceased. St. Catherine of Siena remained conscious, attentive, and present despite physical silence. Those nearby noted composure rather than struggle, as if the prolonged discipline of earlier years had prepared her for this controlled withdrawal. On April 29th, the end arrived without interruption. No vision was reported. No audible declaration followed. St. Catherine of Siena died at 33, an age already symbolically charged. Yet the moment passed almost unnoticed outside the small circle attending her final hours. Absence replaced presence immediately. Rome did not pause. Institutions continued. Yet within memory, something shifted. St. Catherine of Siena's death marked transition rather than closure, removing the body while leaving unresolved questions suspended within communities already shaped by her actions. Attention turned backward. Letters were reread. Encounters were reassessed. Stories gained coherence only after her silence became permanent. St. Catherine of Siena's life began reorganizing itself in memory, as if meaning required distance from the urgency that had previously driven every decision. Those who doubted found no final refutation. Those who believed found no concluding proof. St. Catherine of Siena left no summary, no explanation, and no closure. The ambiguity remained intact, preserving tension between witness and interpretation beyond her lifetime. The lack of spectacle intensified impact. Death did not resolve debate. Instead, it amplified legacy. St. Catherine of Siena's absence created space for attribution, reflection, and expansion, allowing her influence to operate independently of physical presence or continued intervention. With her passing, the narrative shifted forward. What followed would not depend on action, but on memory, devotion, and claim. St. Catherine of Siena's story did not end in Rome. It began its most contested phase after the body fell silent. After death, associations multiplied. St. Catherine of Siena became protector against fire, illness, miscarriage, temptation, ridicule, and fear. Nurses, cities, and nations claimed her. These roles formed gradually, shaped by collective memory rather than decree, as communities linked survival and endurance to her remembered presence. Posthumous miracles followed similar patterns. Healing stories circulated near her name. Prayers were offered. Recoveries were reported. St. Catherine of Siena remained absent, yet invoked. The distance between cause and outcome widened, allowing belief and skepticism to coexist without final resolution or enforced conclusion. Canonization formalized what memory had already stabilized. Later, she was declared a doctor of the Church, an acknowledgement of intellectual authority rarely granted to women. St. Catherine of Siena's words joined doctrine, securing permanence not through power, but through sustained influence over conscience. This recognition did not simplify her story. Debate persisted. Some emphasized mysticism. Others stressed discipline or political intervention. St. Catherine of Siena resisted single interpretation, remaining a figure defined by tension rather than clarity, and by endurance rather than spectacle or singular explanation. A moment of silence settled over the narrative. Action ceased. Claims paused. What remained was absence, shaped into presence. St. Catherine of Siena no longer acted, yet continued to be addressed, remembered, and invoked across centuries without exhaustion or diminishing relevance. Across traditions, a universal pattern emerged. People turned toward her in crisis without demanding certainty. St. Catherine of Siena functioned as conduit rather than conclusion, allowing hope, restraint, and courage to coexist within prayer, offered beyond doctrine, language, or institutional boundary lines. Her story bridged time. Medieval streets, modern hospitals, private fear, public responsibility. St. Catherine of Siena endured as reference point, reminding observers that transformation need not resolve ambiguity to remain effective or meaningful across changing historical landscapes and lived experience. The final question remained unanswered by design. Why does this story still burn? St. Catherine of Siena offers no reply. The fire persists because memory carries heat, and because lives continue to encounter the same fears she once entered without retreat.